Today, the Republican Party of Virginia held its statewide convention to choose their nominees for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. And especially amongst the gubernatorial candidates, notwithstanding Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment, often recited in this race by just about every candidate, the competition has been fiercely fought with very little concerning issues, and mostly personal attacks about who is the more conservative and who is a stronger supporter of the former President Donald Trump. In a pandemic that has changed the lives of all Americans, has found over half of Virginians volunteering for at least the first shot of an experimental vaccine, and that has closed churches, schools, and businesses and required everyone to wear non-medical grade facial coverings, that a blue ribbon research study by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health had determined a decade ago to be useless in a pandemic, evolving science notwithstanding. Regardless of who is the victor in the Republican primary, and choosing the example of the statewide candidates, let's just for a moment retreat into our ideological and partisan echo chambers, focused only on elections, and simply forget about a pandemic pathogen that even Joe Biden admitted in his address to the nation to announce his American Rescue Plan was the most important issue in America. And according to Forbes, the sole determining issue on voters' minds to deliver his mandate to go to the White House. And historically, it is of note that until the infection of the former president, allegedly from a super spreader event at the Rose Garden, according to Dr. Fauci, a medical event that scientists back in the 1980s had determined might only be possible for a pathogen with an extremely low infectious dose, like tuberculosis, which requires only the successful transfer of only 10 bacilli to a healthy person to set off an infection, but an unknown quantum for a novel coronavirus even after a year, or a pathogen with a secondary attack rate of at least 60%, like smallpox, while a novel coronavirus has consistently, in every credible large sample size study involving tracer contacts, has been found to present a secondary attack rate of less than 5%, or 12 times too low for a super spreader. The same thing occurred during the record-breaking turnout election that was coincidentally lost by candidates in the Republican Party of Virginia in the last election. Nationwide, as Republicans and conservative voters, according to Pew Research, simply tuned out on a pandemic as if it simply did not exist, out of sight and out of mind. Continuing in this vein of reviewing statistics, according to the Pew Research Center, just like most Americans who reportedly spend as much as 67 minutes per day consuming news content, 2 1/3 minutes on hard copy news sources, and only 2 minutes on online news stories, more likely than not, fed to them on their news feeds on the internet and remote devices, retreating from the world to mental safe zones of news reinforcing what they already want to believe, relying solely on news sources that correspond with their partisan and ideological orientation. Also, according to the Pew Research Center, while a novel coronavirus was the center of attention of every American back in the very month in which the Richmond Free Press wrote a feature story on Mohammed Norman Oliver, the state health commissioner, who could not even explain the role of tracer contacts to the press by May, a critical day one task in a pandemic, and who had waited until June to hire from over 6,000 resumes only 168 for a total of 1,300 positions. In July 2019, it was determined by that same Pew Research Center that 75% of Americans believe that trust in the federal government is shrinking, while 64% believe that trust between Americans is shrinking. And most Americans believe that that trust is shrinking between Americans because Americans just aren't as reliable as they used to be 20 years ago. Yet probably already tuned out on a novel coronavirus, state Republicans who only thought about the public health crisis when they were arguing about whether to hold an assembled convention in Lynchburg, which many believe would have heavily favored the self-described disruptor, Pete Snyder, who would bring integrity to elections, according to his campaign. They somehow missed the story in late March about the state's top doctor, most responsible for every measure in the governor's COVID-19 response, from closed businesses to useless masks, who just happened to have graduated from a college that requires no college entrance exam, when he actually declared a communicable disease a public health threat exactly 1 month before the first laboratory-confirmed case of infection arose on Fort Belvoir, on the very same day that Alexandria Mayor Justin Wilson, who apparently never read about the infamous Liberty Loan Day Parade in Philadelphia during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, had a parade down a busy street for St. Patrick's Day, and would have thought, with all of the attorneys in the legislature who never brought one case to challenge any of Northam's orders, might have at least raised the objection that the Virginia Code actually requires there to be a credible evidence that a communicable disease is actually in an affected area in the Commonwealth. But not even one candidate seeking the nomination for Attorney General to replace Mark Herring brought a case against the lockdowns, the masks, the vaccines, or any other part of the pandemic response. They could have simply grabbed a copy of the interview by the deputy director of the World Health Organization on March 2nd, 2020, that told everyone not to lock down, reiterating that he had just made in a 40-page report after examination of over 55,000 laboratory-confirmed cases, a large sample size tracer contact study if there ever was one, and even stated in plain English for those who did not understand the science that COVID-19 is not an infectious disease. They could have grabbed all of that and gone to court to declare the whole COVID-19 response unconstitutional, but none ever did, for whatever reason. Like it is too little too late for the over half of Virginian residents of adult age to have second thoughts about the experimental vaccine for which they have already volunteered, a vaccine for which, despite assurances for full inclusiveness by the FDA to assure a safe vaccine, the clinical trials actually took the deliberate time to exclude persons with a history of allergic reactions, now coming up in the press as a problem, and pregnant women, who usually present the highest probability for having adverse reactions to new medical treatments, and a vaccine for which the emergency use authorization that helped to approve the vaccines and the Defense Production Act that helped to deliver the vaccines would have actually required COVID-19 to be a biological weapon of terror if you happen to read the law. With the polls closed now on the Republican nominees' convention, it is probably too late to inform those who did not read the news or examine the legislative history for the voting by mail and extended voting periods that have many claiming that the last election was stolen by voter fraud. Because if you did read any of that, you may be a little disappointed to know that the measures were actually passed by bipartisan majorities in Richmond, and even before a novel coronavirus had even arrived. No use crying over spilt milk, and you can't turn back time. Not even Cher can turn back time. But the last record-breaking election was actually very important for another reason. Because for 2 decades, the Kingmaker Congressional District in the entire Commonwealth that had decided the outcome for all statewide elections for the past 2 decades was actually Democrat Congressman Don Byers' 8th Congressional District, where there are actually more government scientists than any congressional district in the nation, and the congressional district with the most federal employees when viewing the military and civilian workforce combined. Because in that year, it was displaced by Congressman Jerry Conley's 11th Congressional District, with the most civilian employees in the federal government than anywhere in the nation, and now the battleground and center of gravity for any statewide election, now enjoying an extended voting period thanks to our Republicans in Richmond working with the Democrats side by side, hand in hand. At least it may be assuring that even in an age of bitter partisanship that has divided most Americans, there are still some things upon which our politicians can agree. Working across the aisle, even if it means permitting schools, businesses, and churches to close down, and creating the conditions for the very voting fraud that they complained about in their races to get the nomination of the party. And one Republican legislator down in Richmond actually brought a suit so that you could travel all the way to Richmond in a pandemic and not be locked out of the building to see him. Statistically, civilian federal employees tend to be very progressive and loyal Democrat voters, and their abundance may have a little bit to do with why Republicans tend to lose in VA 8 and VA 11. And retreating to your partisan and political echo chambers for news, perhaps the only one that may have caught the story about the recent nomination of chairman for the Merit Systems Protection Board, the government agency that assures the integrity of our civil service system, may have been lost. But what is somewhat surprising is to compare how many headlines made the news when the government shut down and the paychecks for furloughed federal employees was in jeopardy, with what has become the longest lack of a quorum at the MSPB in history. Normally, 2 months at most. The organization, first created in 1978, a reform ushered in with Jimmy Carter, and as a backlash to the events that caused the resignation before impeachment of Richard Nixon at the Watergate. One might find it odd that not even the Federal Workers Union was actually as silent throughout this threat to the appellate rights of federal employees who face adverse personnel actions, just as silent as the Republican nominee in VA 8, Jeff Jordan, when the super PAC for the Federal Workers Union made 2 illegal donations to the campaign of Don Beyer, his Democrat opponent, totaling $3,000. Not even a word, but he promised that if elected, he was a veteran military officer and would fight for you. And perhaps we will never know what that might have been like because he lost. And it is intriguing that during the longest lack of a quorum in the history of MSPB, that the Federal Workers Union, with Jerry Conley, with the most civilian federal employees, and Don Beyer with the most government scientists, and second only to Conley in constituents employed as civilians with and military with the federal government, were just as silent about that issue of importance to federal employees who might face adverse personnel actions as they were on May 11th, 2018, when the departing acting chairman Mark Robbins issued a withdrawal policy without the required 60-day public comment period that also worked essentially to fraudulently induce federal employees with cases stuck in a backlog numbering in the thousands to request a withdrawal of their cases, languishing in limbo, in exchange for what was called a final order that they told federal employees that they could take to another court. And if you had filed your appeal with a convenient online form and did not believe that you required an attorney because people like Mark Robbins were also Democrats and would fight for you, just like you are probably assured that Robbins is now working for you as the general counsel for the Office of Personnel Management, you may not know that under the federal rules of procedure, which govern all matters in federal courts, you can only have a final order reviewed on appeal if that order is adverse to you. But if you request withdrawal of your appeal from the MSPB, that final order will grant your request, and that is not adverse to you because you asked for it. If you are invited to a poker game and do not know who the sucker is, it is probably you. This briefing is unclassified. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.